It's so wonderful to see you all here in my parlor in Hiram on this May 11th of 1865. We have a beautiful spring day, which leads us to think sadly that we are just 1 month distant from our president's demise. It's difficult to be cheerful knowing that President Lincoln was assassinated less than a month ago. But we will hope that the government will continue and that life will continue. And we have reasons to be cheerful with the war ending, do we not? Yes. So we can be cheerful and hopeful at the same time. And I think some of you know my husband, James Garfield. When we first were married just a few years ago, not too long before the war started, we spent our first years in Mrs. Northrup's boarding house here in Hiram. We didn't have enough money to have our own home. And so we were in the boarding house. Mr. Garfield was very busy at this point, teaching at the Eclectic Institute, not far from our home here in Hiram, and also serving as the principal of that institution, as well as preaching somewhere on the Western Reserve every Sunday. He also studied for and passed the Ohio Bar. And then in 1859, shortly before the war, he was elected to the Ohio Senate to represent our portion of Ohio. So he had a number of duties that took him away from home, had to spend some time in Columbus as well with the meeting of the sessions of the Senate. And that's where he was on April 12th, 1861, when a man burst in to the chamber and said, "Fort Sumter has been fired upon." A woman shrieked, "Glory to God." And it was the first words of any woman in that chamber. My husband was a good friend of Jacob Cox, and they were roommates. And the two of them knew with the war starting that they wanted to do their part. They wanted to offer their services to Governor Denison. And so the two started to study because neither one had military experience. My James had never been a soldier. He was a teacher and a preacher. So they began studying Napoleonic tactics and George Washington's maneuvers in the wars that he was in, so that when they finally decided they would report for duty, they could throw themselves right into their work. Just before the war started in 1860, we had our first child, Eliza Arabella, named after our mothers. We call her Little Trot. She could be a handful, as most of you ladies know who have children, especially in this toddler age. But this is the young lady that started our family, little Eliza. Throwing himself right into all the duties. After studying his tactics, he painted blocks, 2 different colors, red and blue, like opposing armies, and laid them out, trying out these tactics on the floor. And then finally, knew enough, he thought, to go to Governor Denison and ask for a regiment of his own. And after much discussion, he was given the 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, except that there was no Ohio 42nd OVI. It was just a unit on paper. And so my husband had to use those oratorical skills, those preaching skills, to go out into the Western Reserve here in Ohio and recruit young men. He went into the church pulpits. He started here in Hiram at the Eclectic, and Company A was filled in just 2 or 3 days with a lot of the young male students from the Eclectic Institute. And they actually did some drilling right here on the Hiram Hill. And before they were sent down to Camp Chase in Columbus. And that's where the serious training took place. Now, I moved back in with my parents here in Hiram, along with little Trot, sort of a step back from the boarding house and my own independence. But you know, with the war, we had to conserve our money, and it was thought best that I should go back home to my parents, who only lived just a little ways away. And my sister Nellie, my younger sister, was quite a help with little Trot. Now, you may not know that I also have two brothers that joined the war. John, the older of the two, here's our family, our siblings, John, 26 when the war began. So he was a bit wiser, a bit older than our younger brother, who you'll hear about in a minute. But John had a wife and two children, with another on the way. And so he wisely responded to an ad that he saw in Ohio newspaper for joining the Quartermaster Corps. And John had some very good skills with horses and wagons. And so that would keep him away from the front. He would be working on the supply lines and getting the very vital things to the Army, but more at the back of the Army and away from the battles. So that was very wise of him, and I think my sister-in-law Maddie appreciated the fact that even though he wanted to do his duty, he could be further from the front than my James. Now, younger brother Joe, he looks very innocent in this picture, does he not? He's about 10 years younger than I am. He's quite a character. Joe thought the war would be an adventure. He and his buddies from the Eclectic Institute here in Hiram thought they would join up, sign up for a 3-month stint, and the war would be over, but they'd have all this adventure in those 3 months. And he first enlisted with the 19th Ohio, and then went AWOL because he had some friends in the 23rd Ohio, and then deserted once again to join the 42nd to be with his brother-in-law, my husband James. So he had quite a record of desertion, you could say. And he also eventually ended up in the Quartermaster Corps. And just to show you Joe's personality, he and his fellow soldiers in the Quartermaster group saw a wonderful crate of apples. And so they took the scabbards on their muskets and sneaked up and started to pierce the apple and pull them out to enjoy the apples themselves. These were contraband apples. These were Confederate apples, but our Union boys were able to have a delicious afternoon thanks to my brother's sneakiness. So the war begins, and all of us in Hiram, all the ladies especially, we gather, including my mother, Arabella, my mother-in-law, Eliza, my sister, Nellie. We are industrious little bees. We're making bandages. We're sewing housewives, the little sewing kits that go into the field with the men. We're canning peaches. We are making a fine stand of colors for the Hiram boys, a banner they would be proud to take into battle. And then in addition, we're all working on behalf of our own relatives. I was busily making night shirts for Mr. Garfield and some flannel shirts to wear into the field so that he could pack these into his trunk. And off they go, training. And I only visited him once during the wartime, and that was for 1 week at Camp Chase. I left little Trot with my mother-in-law and spent a week down at Camp Chase. A lot of the wives were coming and going at that point during the training. I was surprised that it wasn't more isolated and that it wasn't just men only, but especially with the officers. My husband only a lieutenant colonel, but some of the higher-ups had their wives in camp for several weeks at a time. And then off they went on a barge, on a steamship, down to Cincinnati, and in my husband's case, the 42nd went into Kentucky. He didn't write very much about the horrors that he was seeing as he went through the war, but one of the first letters he sent me was very emotional. March 10th, 1862, from Piketon, Kentucky. My dear Crete, that's the nickname that he uses for me. a noble young man from Medina County died a few days ago. I had enlisted him, but not till I had spent 2 hours answering the objection of his father, who urged that he was too young to stand the exposure. He was the only child. I cannot feel myself to blame in the matter, but I assure you I would rather fight a battle than to meet his father. This fighting with disease is infinitely more horrible than any battle. This is the price of saving the Union? My God, what a sacrifice. Your James. Many of his letters, which we ladies hoped for every day, many of his letters concerned where they were camping. He included drawings of his tent and the layout of his cot and his desk, maybe a little map of where the battle was going to take place. Nothing too horrific. He said even if he could talk about them, he wouldn't. And maybe he would tell me when he got home. The men had troubles sometimes with their equipment following along with them. So one of the more silly letters talks about his trunk being left behind. Now he starts out, the field of Shiloh, April 21st, 1862, my dear Crete, after the longest space ever intervened between your letters to me, yours of the 5th instant was finally received. It's the only word from northern Ohio I have had since I left the big sandy river in Kentucky. I assure you, I have never been in so much need of letters from home as since my arrival here. I was writing almost daily. I even gave little Trot a pen and some paper to scratch out some things for her papa. But the mails were slow and sometimes non-existent. He continues, I'm still in a rather unpleasant condition in regard to my trunk. I left Louisville with nothing but my overcoat and belt pistol. The trunk I was obliged to leave, and it should be brought forward by a government wagon, but I've heard nothing of it since, and fear I never shall. It contained all my clothing, letters, commissions, etc., so that I have not even a change. When the Aid Society came down with a steamer for the wounded, they gave me a pair of drawers and an undershirt. But for that, I should have been wearing the same underclothes more than 3 weeks. So sometimes it was a bit humorous. I can understand the difficulties, but we ladies would be happier to hear this in Hiram than to hear of the battles. But I have to tell you, almost daily we had word, either from friends' letters or in newspapers, of men dead or dying. And we were fortunate here in Hiram because we're rather remote. We didn't have battles at our doorstep. We didn't suffer too many shortages in supplies and things, but these newspapers and these letters really brought the war home to us here in northern Ohio. Finally, disease affected my family as well. My brother John was taking the supplies across the Cumberland Gap with General Morgan. He had 12 wagons he was responsible for moving, and he came down with typhoid. There's no cure for it. So here in Hiram, my mother and I received a letter that we should come to John's side. He is in the old hospital, building number 2 in Lexington, Kentucky. And we should come as soon as possible. He was not faring well. This is August 1862, so the weather is not helping his situation. So my mother and I started for Kentucky, only to be waylaid a bit when I received a telegram from my husband, now Brigadier General. It says, I am here, unwell, at the Waddell House in Cleveland. He had contracted camp fever, which is the overall name for all kinds of things you get in the Army, the dysentery and losing weight and sleeplessness, and he had lost 40 pounds in just a few weeks. And so the medical staff determined that he should come back to Ohio, recuperate on a leave. So I had to let my mother continue on to Kentucky on her own to retrieve my brother, her oldest son. I was responsible for my husband's care. That was vital at that time. And so my mother ended up having to bring my brother home to Hiram all by herself after many days. I believe that John died on August 12th, if I have the memory correct, of 1862. And she brought him to be buried in the cemetery here close by in Hiram. In the meantime, Mr. Garfield needs quite a bit of attention to get him ready to go back into battle. And we took up in a cabin with little Trot in Howland Springs near Warren, Ohio. And it was the first time in our marriage that we were truly alone together. When we were first married, we were in the boarding house, and we always had other people around us, including my husband's mother. Also, then I moved back home with my mother, and there were family and friends always coming and going. But now in Howland Springs, we truly had an isolated cabin where I could nurse him back to health. And little Trot would sit on his lap and look at the buttons on his uniform jacket and call them chickens. They're really eagles, as we all know, but she thought that was quite something, that Papa was wearing chickens on his jacket. And this time together not only healed Mr. Garfield, but it seemed to strengthen our marriage, because the first years were so difficult with all the absences and such, but this gave us a chance to kindle a stronger love for one another. But when he got well, I had to give him back to the Army. He ended up home about 6 weeks, and then they called him to Washington. At that point, though, before he left, we decided we could rent a house. This house right here wasn't quite as big as this originally. We're renting this from Mr. Brown. Finally, Mr. Garfield did the mathematics and determined that it would have been less expensive for us if we should just purchase it. So we spent $825 to buy this house from Mr. Brown, and I moved in. My father, a carpenter, helped me superintend the enlargement of the house here towards the back and put the railings on the porch. We spent as little money as necessary. I kept getting letters back and forth from General Garfield about being wise with the expenses and let your father decide on things. But we were very cautious and still had a nice home. I wanted it to be just perfect for when he would leave the Army and would join us here in Hiram. So 1862 was a big year with all of that. Little Trot was in my lap when I wrote this letter. November 16th, 1862, from Hiram, my own dearest Jamie. In our own first home, I sit down for the first time to write to you. I am not entirely settled yet, but have the lower rooms looking cozy and comfortable. I have had a hard week's work, I assure you, and yet there is a great deal to be done before everything will be in order. It was very amusing to watch the astonishment with which little Trot looked around in her new home when I first brought her here. But the next morning, she very complacently claimed all as her own, saying, "This is me's house." At the same time, he had said there was a present coming for me for our 4th anniversary. And this is what arrived. A daguerreotype of the general with a few more pounds put on, but not entirely healthy looking, I should say. But now little Trot had this picture on the table in our new house. And one day I saw her doing this with the picture. I said, "What are you doing?" She says, "I'm feeding Papa candy." She's quite charming and very rosy-cheeked. So Mr. Garfield had been at Shiloh and Corinth before he got ill. It took him further into the south to Tuscumbia, Alabama, repairing railroads. And that was his first chance to see slavery, the peculiar institution, as he wrote to me. Seeing the men working in the fields for their masters, toiling in the hot sun. So I think that his experiences in the war brought home to him the importance of family, of friends, of being with your little one. He would often write about the fact that if something happened to him, that she would not remember him. And he knew that by experience because his own father had died when James was only 18 months old. And so all he knew of his father was what his older siblings and his mother told him. So this is a concern of our soldiers every day, that they are not going to make it back and that family members will not remember them. My love of this house just grew as I made it really as comfortable as possible for Mr. Garfield. After the Battle of Chickamauga, where he escaped narrowly with his life, I must add, riding to the front to General Thomas's side, his horse Billy was shot at, fell out from under him. Luckily, Billy survived. My husband arrived at Thomas's side unscathed, but his orderly had been killed. And that Battle of Chickamauga occurred in September 1863. And not long after that, I gave birth to our first son, Little Chickamauga, as he was called, for a few weeks. Finally, after that battle, his father was able to come back home briefly because he had to file a report with Edwin Stanton in Tennessee and then head back home for a brief interlude. Now, I should mention that while my husband was home on sick leave, he was elected to Congress, the U.S. Congress. He was ill. We were in Howland Springs, but his friends worked on his behalf and got him elected as the new congressman from the 19th district here in Ohio. His term wouldn't start till early December of 1863. So at the point of time when Chickamauga had been concluded and he's filing reports, now he has a dilemma. It's going to look very bad if he doesn't go back to the front, back to the Army, right? If he takes his seat in Congress, this is not going to go over well with people back home and his fellow soldiers. So we asked President Lincoln for advice. And Lincoln told him, I can find other generals. I have plenty of those. But I need your help in Congress. So I'm hoping that you will resign your commission in the Army and take your seat so that we can finish this war, that we can pay for this war, and scale the Army down to the size it should be when there are no wars. Unfortunately, his visit home to our house here in Hiram to meet his new son, who we named Harry Augustus after two of our Hiram friends. This visit also ended up being his last time with little Trot. 3.5 years old now, and she contracted diphtheria in late November. And little Trot died December 1st of 1863 with her papa there in his uniform. We were devastated. Even with all the losses we had encountered during the war of friends and family, to lose a little one who had barely started in life just tore at the atoms of your heart. I had to be strong, though, because little Hal, little Chickamauga, was just 1.5 months old. I had to go on. And my strength became Mr. Garfield's strength and his way to endure probably the worst thing that had ever happened to him at that point. Because he had to leave. Right after little Trots' funeral, he had to go to Washington to take his seat in Congress. And he showed up in his uniform on that first day. He wrote this letter to me. Washington, December 6, 1863, my darling Crete. I arrived here at 6 o'clock in the evening. I cannot tell you what a lonely, dreary ride it was to me. He traveled by the cars, by train. Today, I have resigned my commission in the Army and am now, for the first time since August 12th of 1861, a citizen. I have come away to my rooms at the corner of New York Avenue and 13th Street and am now here alone. The rooms are very large and I am more alone than ever before in my life. It seems to me I cannot stay here this whole winter and spring for the congressional session. How constantly the image of our precious lost one leaps into my memory and heart. I find myself sitting alone, calling her by her pet names, asking her if she loves me, and almost hoping to hear an answer. Precious little darling. I wonder if she can know how her papa loves her and longs for her. I find here awaiting me your letter of November 6th, in which you tell me of her crying that I came away without kissing her in my leaving for Washington this last time. I could say that the little darling had left without kissing me. Despite this heavy loss in our life, our family home returned to some normalcy as Mr. Garfield took his place in the U.S. Congress. Typically, the freshman congressmen board in Washington during the sessions of Congress, and we family members stay home, which is ideal. Here's that lovely house to be home in with new baby Hal to take care of. I received a letter from my brother Joe. He's been made a captain recently and is now an assistant quartermaster down in Texas and Louisiana. So I'm sure that there will be more stories coming from the South from him, even though it is peacetime. He's still working on behalf of the Army for a few more months. And Mr. Garfield will spend the rest of the war in Congress on the Committee of Military Affairs, doing just what Mr. Lincoln asked, serving the Army in being able to pay for its expenses as well as to trimming it to a post-war Army. So here we are, with this wicked rebellion crushed, and finally with our men back home again. We can be hopeful that peace will reign here in our United States of America, so that young Hal and our new little one that we're expecting for this October will have a better world in which to live. Wouldn't you agree?